Rising tension among NATO allies. How serious is the threat to the survival of the Western alliance? Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. When NATO's founding members signed the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4th, 1949, they declared themselves, quote, resolved to unite their efforts for collective defense and for the preservation of peace and security. But today, nearly 76 years later, the future of NATO is in doubt like never before, with serious questions being raised about its very survival. There's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Dmitry Babich is a journalist and Russian political analyst. Aurel Braun is an international affairs and political science professor at the University of Toronto. Also with us is Anton Fedyashin. He is a history professor at American University. And Klaus Larres is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Klaus Larres, let me start with you. You know, the relationship between the United States under President Trump and NATO is fraught with tension. I think it's fair to say that it's a very ambivalent relationship. You know, in his first term, President Trump threatened to pull the United States out of NATO, and he's still been threatening NATO and criticizing them for not spending enough on defense. Now, he recently met with the relatively new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, right here in Washington at the White House. Let's listen to some of what they had to say about this relationship.
I was able to raise hundreds of billions of dollars. I just said, we're not going to be involved with you if you're not going to pay. And the money started pouring in, and NATO became much stronger because of my actions and working along with a lot of people, including Mark.
What happened the last couple of weeks is really staggering. The Europeans committing to a package of 800 billion defense spending. The Germans now, potentially up to $500 billion extra in defense spending. And then, of course, you had Keir Starmer here, the British Prime Minister, and others, all committing to much higher defense spending. We're not there. We need to do more, but I really want to work together with you in a run-up to the The Hague Summit to make sure that we will have a NATO which is really reinvigorated under your leadership.
That was Mark Rutte speaking there. Klaus, the question is, can the NATO alliance survive if one of its key members, the United States, is so ambivalent about the relationship?
Yeah, the last few months were indeed very difficult for the transatlantic alliance and for the NATO alliance. However, one has to see that unlike in his first term, when Trump really made efforts behind the scenes to consider leaving NATO, which of course shocked the Europeans when they found out about it. A similar initiative seems not to have occurred so far, while of course everyone is concerned that that may be the case in the next few weeks, the next few months. Trump has not said anything about that at all. So everyone is concerned, but so far it looks that the NATO alliance will succeed. And Trump credits himself with raising more money, as we just heard in that clip. That is only partially true. It was really Putin's invasion of Ukraine, 2014, 2022, and Trump's pressure on top of that, which made the Europeans in particular raise their defense expenditure and get their act together in a military and security sphere.
Anton Fedyashin, Klaus mentioned Ukraine there. Now, the United States under Trump and its NATO allies see a resolution to this conflict in very different ways. In fact, until President Trump insisted on a ceasefire, the Europeans looked at continuing this war, supplying more weapons to Ukraine as well. President Trump says he wants a ceasefire, but at the same time, he very publicly berated the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky when Zelensky visited Washington not so long ago. Let's watch what happened there.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country, that's back to you, far more than a lot of people said they should have.
So We have these divergent views among NATO member states on how this should be resolved. How much of a strain does that put on the alliance, Anton?
Well, it's the biggest strain on the alliance right now, together with the spending issue, by the way, because commitments is one thing. When the Europeans actually start putting that money towards defense is another. Europe, unfortunately for itself, has gotten itself into a position where its economies cannot possibly maintain the level of spending that the European governments are committing. And some of them have already said that they will start cutting public spending. And then why are we surprised that right-wing parties are coming to power? The other issue, of course, the real division in NATO is what to do about Ukraine, because NATO is profoundly divided within itself about the commitment that it is willing to make to the actual war effort. So far, NATO has been very happy to have the Ukrainians fighting the Russians until the last Ukrainian. I guess if they have to, from Europe's point of view, the Europeans have been giving them weapons and money. They're, for the most part, out of weapons. They're running out of money. And ultimately, despite all of the commitments that NATO countries have really made to increasing their defense spending, which is absolutely necessary for Europe, by the way, to regain its subjectivity. In other words, its status as a subject in international relations as an object. But for all of that, look where we are when it comes to the question of Ukraine and peacekeeping troops. The Europeans cannot do anything without the American backstop, as Keir Starmer of Great Britain calls it, but that really means without American support. So the U.S. is clearly still in the driver's seat, and the Europeans are a distant second. And finally, on the question of money and resources, listen, it's very important to separate the finances that are committed to projects and the capability, the capacity to actually produce weapons and hardware. Europe doesn't have that capacity, certainly not to ramp up the production of weapons nearly as fast as it thinks it can. Now, if the resources are dedicated to that, the Europeans can do an enormous amount. They have a very highly educated population and all of the technology that they need. But this is a very long-term process and a very long-term investment, and the money's not going to come out of thin air. It will end up cutting into social budgets.
Klaus, what is your view on these diverse views within NATO and how to resolve the Ukraine conflict? One other thing, Klaus, is how did the Europeans view that sort of very bruising encounter in the Oval Office?
Well, I don't quite agree with what was just said by Anton about affordability. Of course, it will be painful and social budgets will have to be cut. But, you know, the individual countries in the end will have to raise taxes and they will be able to afford it. It will be painful. They will not like it, or the population will not like it, but they can quite afford it. These are all largely very rich countries. Also, what we could read today is that the European members are starting to think about a NATO without the United States. And they want to come into a process which gradually allows the United States to withdraw from NATO and focus more on Asia and the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
But want to make that happen in a gradual process rather than have Trump suddenly announce he's going to withdraw next week, which of course would create a lot of chaos in NATO. So the Europeans are preparing themselves for having to do without the United States and having to do much more themselves.
Aurel Braun, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. One of Mark Rutte's reported goals when he visited Washington just a week ago was to persuade Donald Trump to keep the United States in NATO. Now, a central pillar of NATO's charter is Article 5, the so-called one for all for one collective defense doctrine. Here's Mark Rutte talking about that. Let's listen.
I've spoken many times with President Trump. He's a good friend. We worked now for 8 years together. No, it was for 4 years when he was president first time. We stayed in touch when he was out of the presidency. And of course, we have now re-engaged very actively again. And he is totally committed, as he said many times, to Article 5, to NATO. So please, let's stop gossiping about what the US might or might not do. They are in NATO, they are committed to NATO, they're committed to Article 5. This is what they consistently say, including Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, the President himself and others.
So, Aurel, do you think the United States is still committed to Article 5? I mean, would it go to war in Europe if one of the member states were threatened or attacked?
There was always a question about this. You will recall that the French insisted on the General de Gaulle, President de Gaulle at that time, to create the force de frappe because they were not absolutely certain that the United States would come to the aid of Europe if it faced nuclear destruction itself. We can also recall that the French removed themselves from the military structure for several years, and then they came back. So when we look at NATO, it has always been this issue that this alliance, which is the longest in history, and I would say the most successful in history, has endured many, many stresses and has survived those stresses. So any word about the death of NATO is certainly premature. But there are some disturbing signs. I mean, Donald Trump clearly wants to pivot towards the Pacific. I do not know if he has a sufficiently good understanding of geopolitics that you cannot show weakness in one area and then display strength in another area. There has been word that there has been some lack of cooperation in terms of counterinsurgency on the part of the American NSC. There was a report that perhaps the United States is considering giving up the position of Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, SACEUR, and we see that there was a pushback against that from the Republican chairs of the Senate and of the House Armed Services Committee. So this is a struggle, but I think overall Mark Rutte is probably correct, that the United States is in there, in NATO, it is committed to defending NATO, but the question is how much that commitment will be in terms of concrete terms as there's a shift, as Europe starts to gear up. It will take some time for Europe to scale up, but we should never underestimate the capacity of Europe to scale up. And I think we need to look at Germany. There has been a sea change in the case of Germany, how they approach geopolitics and what they plan to do under the new chancellor. And I think that is really instructive and essential.
All right, let's go to Moscow to Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, good to see you. Of course, NATO was formed after World War II by the United States and its European allies to counter what they saw as a threat that was posed by the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. But we've seen over the years, as Aurel Braun just pointed out, there's been stresses and strains in the relationship, but it has survived largely intact. But how would Moscow be looking at these latest strains in NATO?
Well, we just see that we are dealing with some very immoral, duplicitous people. I mean, Mark Rutte, who claimed to be, so steadfast and so committed to, Euro-Atlantic ideology, which is obviously challenged by Trump, is now saying that Trump is a good friend, that he is committed to Article 5. So we see that Mr. Rutte is ready to change his opinions every day. In the same way, when we see the elected chancellor of Germany, let's call it that way, when we see Friedrich Merz saying that, I quote, Europe is under threat, Germany is under threat, because there are some military action taking place near Kursk and in Donbass. The last time Germany was under threat because there was some military action near Kursk and Donbass was in 1943, and certainly Germany was under threat then, but because of its own actions. In the same way, of course, I will hear now from Klaus that Russia attacked Ukraine. When the so-called special military operation started in 2022, that was the first time when troops were moving from east to west since 1989. Between 1989 and 2014, troops were only moving from west to east. NATO was expanding, saying at the same time that Russia was posing greater and greater threat to it. Well, of course, if you're expanding, if you take other countries and make them hostile to a certain country in the east, of course, that country is going to be more hostile to you, but it's not the fault of Russia. It's not the fault of that country. It's the fault of the expansionists in Europe. So, of course, this is seen very negatively. We have no illusions about Mr. Trump. His foreign policy is mercantile. He wants to make money. His suggestions to Ukraine are supremely cynical. You know, when he says that Ukraine should cede its atomic energy power stations to the United States, making them the property of the United States, and that will make Ukraine secure, that sounds like racket, you know. If you want to preserve your business from any threats from outside, just give that business to me. I will take care of it. You will not face any threats. Just it won't be your business. It will be mine. Right. This is the meaning of what Mr. Trump is telling Mr. Zelensky. So we see whom we're dealing with, and the scene is not pretty.
All right, let me go to Klaus Larres. Klaus, I want you to respond to some of what Dmitry Babich had to say there. But before I do that, let's play a little bit of what the man who's expected to become Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, had to say. Let's listen to him.
The rift in the Atlantic is getting deeper. And the question is whether or not we can still celebrate 70 years of the Federal Republic of Germany's NATO membership with the Americans. The question is not answered. Let's hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And the worst can be that we Europeans must now finally and definitively take the security of our European continent into our own hands, because the security guarantees of the Americans are no longer guaranteed.
So very forthright words there from Friedrich Merz. Klaus, what did you make of it?
Yeah, let me unravel what my colleague just said. I mean, regarding Russia, of course, you know, Russia had difficult relations with Georgia, expanded into Georgia 2008. There were conflicts with Moldova, then 2014 into the Donbass and Crimea, of course, and then 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We are all aware of that. This was clearly aggressive behavior on the part of Russia and active military aggressive behavior with active military troops. But my colleague has a point when he says that President Trump himself is above all interested in making economic gains from bringing a ceasefire about in Ukraine. And I think everyone knows that, how Trump is thinking. Regarding Germany, the Germans are not expecting a Russian invasion. No one talks about that. But it is the Russian threat to the borders of Europe and to the Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, Poland, Georgia again, of course, Moldova, and of course, Ukraine, which also makes the Germans fearful for their own security. And the German army is run down. The German military has been run down. You know, there are hardly any tanks which are functioning anymore, and soldiers have to look after their own equipment. And this explains why so much more money, new money, is put into the military, and why Friedrich Merz talks the way he talks. He's also very, as we heard, he's also very and deeply concerned that the United States may change its traditional support of NATO, or maybe even withdraw from NATO. Yeah. And all that explains that military drive, but not because they expect the Russians to come into Germany. This is well exaggerated.
Yeah. Let me go to Dmitry on this. Dmitry, you know, NATO has been of deep concern to Russia for a very long time, NATO's proximity to Russia for one. What is the best case scenario for NATO as far as Russia is concerned? You know, after the end of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact was dismantled. Well, we had Russia remaining off the Soviet Union. I mean, do they think NATO is a Cold War relic that should also be dismantled?
Absolutely. NATO should have been dismantled. And I think if you ask me about the best case scenario, we should return to that great dream of Mikhail Gorbachev, a common European home. I think he was serious about it. And Boris Yeltsin was serious about it. And Vladimir Putin was certainly serious about it. In the first years of his rule, 100%. If you look at his actions, how he supported the Western military action in Afghanistan, how he abandoned the Soviet bases in Vietnam and in Cuba, certainly. Unfortunately, the actions of the West, if you look at them, you will see that all the crises that Klaus has mentioned, they were all started by Western powers. In 2008, it was Georgia who first bombarded Tsin Valley and basically took I quote Mr. Saakashvili, 70% of South Ossetia's territory during the first day. It was later, when Russian troops entered that area through the rock tunnel, that the situation changed. So it was a response from Russia. In the same way in Ukraine, first it was the coup that ousted the legally elected president in 2014. All the tragedies followed later. And that coup was openly supported by the EU.
Yeah.
So I think that the suggestion was very clear from Russia on the eve of the so-called special military operation. Let's return to 1997, when we signed the founding act on relations between NATO and Russia. That would be the best-case scenario.
Right. Anton, as the European countries consider boosting their defense spending, and in fact they want to now buy arms from local manufacturers, which means that the US market will lose that. But one of the other proposals they're looking at is to extend the nuclear umbrella, the United Kingdom and French nuclear umbrella, to the rest of Europe. What do you make of that, and how would that reshape the current European security architecture?
I don't think it would reshape the current European architecture, because the American nuclear umbrella theoretically has always covered Europe. These are just phrases that are being massaged around to make it look like the Europeans are actually doing something constructive. So all of talk about nuclear umbrellas, as far as I'm concerned, is posturing, because if it should ever come to an exchange of nuclear blows, all of these guarantees and European stability will be out of the window. The question is, in what circumstances, under what conditions, would France, Great Britain, or the United States actually use its weapons? The U.S., by the way, has weapons in several European countries stationed there, although they remain under American control. What are the conditions? And this brings us back to Article 5 that has been mentioned several times here, and I would encourage all of our viewers to take the 30 seconds that it would take them to actually bring up the NATO Charter and to actually read the wording of Article 5, which is very interesting, because it was drafted by the United States. The original treaty of 1949 was, of course, signed here in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, not far from where I am. And Article 5 does not automatically commit the members of NATO to mutual defense. It triggers consultations within each government and allows each government to take the decision of whether it will join a coalition to defend one of its members. Now, the assumption has always been that all of them would do so, especially small countries, helping out the bigger countries because they're so dependent on them. But there's always this margin for decision making, and the Americans put that in from the get-go in 1949 because they wanted that margin of safety where some member, having made a catastrophic misjudgment or a mistake, wouldn't drag entire alliance into a third world war.
Great. Good clarification there, Anton. Aurel Braun, I want to get back to the situation in NATO. One of the other proposals being talked about by the European nations, particularly the United Kingdom, as well as Germany, is to send peacekeeping forces into Ukraine, initially to secure the ceasefire, and then possibly as part of a long-term settlement. Would that work?
There will be problems with that. And perhaps let me just address a couple of other things. First, with what Professor Fedyashin said, and I think that's ignoring custom in NATO. Yes, every document can be interpreted in a variety of ways, but as an international law, there is a customary development of habit and how it operates. And NATO has operated on the basis that it would provide that kind of help. There's never an absolute guarantee. There are circumstances that have to be taken into account, but I would not dismiss Article 5 in such a light way. I think that is a very bad mistake. But also in
just to clarify something, Aurel Braun, it doesn't oblige every country in NATO to fight on behalf of the country that's being attacked or threatened, right?
It does not oblige it in the sense that it is written in as something that is absolute, but it is something that has become a customary rule in NATO. that NATO is an organization that is political as well as military. And in case one of the members of that alliance is attacked, and Article 5 is basically a defensive act. It does not commit the alliance to an offensive action, but it is committed to defending its members. And the custom is that if a member would be attacked by a non-member of NATO, then the custom would be that indeed that there would be that kind of help. And this is why I think countries want to get into NATO. And this is what it takes me back to what Mr. Babich has said. And that's a perfect illustration why NATO will remain relevant, because it is this inversion of history, where Russia is always the victim, never the aggressor. The use of the Soviet lexicon of always blaming everybody else. NATO did not enlarge because it wished to do so. It enlarged because countries felt threatened by Russia. Let us not forget that there was something called the Founding Act, NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, which was followed by the NATO-Russia Council, where a four-star Russian general was allowed to be in the antechamber to cooperate with NATO. Russia has ignored that. Let us not forget that the Finnish president, a country that was neutral, said that they joined NATO because it was Russia. The Putin, you need to look at the mirror. And this is why we have the Europeans now scrambling to provide some backbone to some kind of peace agreement.
Okay. I'm sorry to rush you there, Aurel, but I've only got a minute left. I'm going to get to Dmitry Babich to respond to what you said there. Dmitry, go ahead.
I want to say that I never used the Soviet rhetoric here, because I think that the Soviet Union was a threat to Russia in the late 40s, and was a threat to Europe in the late 40s, and certainly under Joseph Stalin. And I'm very unhappy about a return by some people in Russia to the Cold War rhetoric, to the rhetoric of Stalin. But let me put it this way. If Germany acts like Hitler, Russia will act like Stalin. That is very unfortunate that we are returning to this kind of language, but that is a fact. And certainly, in 1997, Russia was serious about NATO-Russia Founding Act. But let me remind you, in 1999, without consulting the UN Security Council, NATO attacked Yugoslavia. So it was the first strain on that relationship. It was not Russia who destroyed the Founding Act of 1997. It was Europe and the United States.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington.